A close reading of the Homeric Odyssey, Episode 4, Book 1, lines 150 to 199. My name's Peter Gainsford. I am a classical scholar in New Zealand, and here we're carrying on with our close reading of the Odyssey in Greek and English side by side. Last time we had an introduction to hospitality scenes as a type scene or typical scene in Homer, and the relationship of the hospitality scene to theoxenia, which is a ritual where you welcome a god into your house for dinner. Today we will start on the conversation between Telemachos and his guest, the disguised Athena. One theme we've looked at previously, the use of Odysseus' name, will come up again here. We'll also get our first look at a depiction of poetic performance, a couple of uses of the Attic dialect, and Homer using the word for blue. So, excuse me, health is not great at the moment. Winter is hitting hard this year. Let me just pour myself a cup of coffee to keep my throat warm as we go. So, we start after the suitors have finished their eating, when they'd put aside desire for drink and food, line 150. This is a very typical line that you're going to see a lot throughout the Odyssey. There's a lot of focus on eating and drinking, actually, in the Odyssey. It's quite interesting how much emphasis there is on that. Sort of basic physical bodily things like eating, drinking, and also other physical activities. Crying. There's a lot of crying in the Odyssey. Be that as it may, let's carry on. That isn't the emphasis here. What we get is, instead of the eating and drinking, we start to get song and dance, as the text puts it, line 152, μνηၤτῆρჟιν orchestuste, for those are the ornaments of a feast, anathemata daitos. A herald, or rather a messenger, comes to deliver a kithara to the singer Phemios. So this is our first depiction of a poetic performance in the Odyssey. Phemios is one of the two main poets that we see performing at various points in the Odyssey. Phemios here in Odysseus' house, and later on in the land of the Phaeacians in Scheria we're going to see another one named Demodocus. To some extent these are self-insertions. They're depictions of how the narrator would like to imagine poets acting. Here, of course, the poet is being mistreated. He has to sing for the suitors under compulsion, as the text says, ἀνάγκῃ. I note, though, that is a textual variant. If you look down at the bottom of the page in your critical edition, or if you're watching on screen, you'll see it here as well. Line 154, 噚παρά μνηπαιτῆρჟιν ἀνάγκῃ. He sang for the suitors under compulsion. There is a textual variant that appears in a life of Homer. This is a mostly fictional biography of Homer that is attributed to Herodotus. But it's not actually Herodotus. This is the pseudo-Herodotean life of Homer. Quotes these two lines, and it has a totally different reading here. Instead of saying he sang for the suitors under compulsion, it says he was by far, he excelled by far all others in singing. πολλὸν ἐκαίνυτο πάντας ἀείδων. No manuscript has that reading. It's only in the pseudo-Herodotean life of Homer, but it's an interesting case of totally independent, apparently, testimony as to the text of the Odyssey. That alternate reading actually would remove the idea that Phemios is under compulsion, of course. And actually, if you've read the Odyssey before, you'll know that this is the one thing that actually saves Phemios' life much later on, when Odysseus and Telemachos are slaughtering all the suitors. Phemios is saved by Telemachos telling Odysseus that he only acted under compulsion. So if you alter this reading here, there's a bit of a it's not a huge continuity problem, but maybe that is one motivation for preferring this reading to the other one. That doesn't necessarily mean it's the more accurate reading. It's just the more literarily pleasing reading. That doesn't mean it's actually a better text. So we should actually take that alternate reading quite seriously, I think. Etoi ho formis don anabolē to kalon ἀείδων. He started playing a prelude to his beautiful singing. So start playing a prelude, that's the verb anabolē, literally to throw up in the air. But in poetic contexts, it means to play a prelude. And anabolē is a musical prelude. Excuse me. And formisdon, he started playing. Formisdon is to one of the standard verbs for to play a lyre. There's a couple of standard terms. Formisdo is the less common one in Homer. The more common one is kitharisdo. Oh, sorry, no. Formisdo is more common in Homer. Kitharisdo is more common in other early poetry. They mean more or less the same thing, but they hint at different musical instruments. Here, in Odyssey, Book 1, line 153, we've got a kitharis, basically a kithara, is mentioned as the instrument that Phemios is playing. The verb, formisdon, tends to suggest a forminx. These are actually different instruments. There were several different instruments available that we could all, in English, we lump them all together as lyres, but the kithara is the largest and most prestigious variant of the lyre, you could say. The forminx is a very old-fashioned, well, it's not so much old-fashioned, but it's certainly a smaller lyre. It's the sound box, instead of having a sound box, it's got a bowl. And the forminx is also particularly associated with sympotic contexts. So, and symposia are where most men would hear most of the poetry that they heard. So, sympotic performance is an important context for poetic performance, and it may be that the use of formisdon hints at the kind of instrument that would be used in a symposion. The kithara is the larger, as I say, more prestigious instrument that was used in formal poetic contests in public. Excuse me. So there's these don't get treated very distinctly in Homer, and it's actually pretty reasonable to lump them together, but it may be of interest to be aware that there is in real life, there was some variation in the kinds of lyres that were available. Another point that I think is worth mentioning in the context of Phemios' singing is that the evidence that early epic poetry was sung is really pretty poor. Poetic contests in classical Greece were primarily rhapsodic contests, as far as we can make out. But the imagery surrounding epic performance is always the imagery of singing, and some people do believe that epic poetry was sung to the accompaniment of a musical instrument. However, there are reasons to be wary of that, let's say. I can't definitely say it's wrong because the evidence isn't good enough. I think it is wrong. I think that epic was always declaimed, recited, with a staff beating time to the hexameter. And that's because of the kinds of imagery that we get surrounding poetic performance. the standard verb for performing hexameter poetry is always ἀείδω, to sing. But we do have plenty of indications that the people who were performing used a staff to beat time, and that they would stitch chunks of poetry together. And stitching is literally what rhapsode means. A rhapsode is someone who stitches, and rhapsodes are the performers who hold a staff and declaim. So what I think is going on with this is that you have this poetic image, and it's an image that you find in modern poetry as well. Whenever a poet talks about how their songs are, talks about their poems as a song or an ode is something sung, but you wouldn't find people actually singing most poetry that's referred to as an ode. Horace's odes weren't sung. This is imagery, this is poetic imagery, and I think it's the same imagery in Homer as we have in modern times. Poems are poetically called songs. The performance of them is poetically called singing. But if you look at something like the opening of the Hesiodic Theogony, you will see that Hesiod is told to start singing by the Muses, but the Muses also give him a staff. That is, the staff makes him a rhapsode. He's not singing with a staff. You need a musical instrument to sing. When we do get testimony about actual music in early Greece, and particularly hexameter music and kitharôidia, the main name that comes up is not Homer, it's Terpander. And it's in the context of that name. Terpander is the one who is associated with developments in musical instruments, changing the tuning or adding extra strings to the musical instruments. Homer is poetry for declaiming. But I won't pretend that this is set in stone. The evidence isn't strong enough to claim this as an absolute truth or anything. It's just, that's my reading of the evidence that we have, that musical performance is associated with people like Terpander and other kitharôidic poets. And we do have fragments of Terpander. It is hexameter, but kitharôidic hexameter and epic hexameter are two totally different things. And Homer is, of course, epic hexameter. So kitharôidic hexameter, it gets sung to a musical accompaniment. Homeric hexameter is declaimed with a staff beating time. And that seems to be the picture of things that we get in the evidence. But as I say, I won't pretend that the evidence is concrete or rock solid. Excuse me again. Let's move on. The conversation between Telemachos and Athena follows. So I just need to adjust some things so I don't lose track of the time. Telemachos addresses Athena. Remember, she is in disguise. And in the introduction to the speech in line 156, what's the textual problem there? I've got the on screen. I've got asterisks marking lines with a textual variant. Okay, gλαυκώπιν Athenain is γλαυκώπid Athenain in one, apparently in one papyrus. Excuse me. Now, yes, this is where Homer uses the word for blue. Blue-eyed Athene. Now, this is obviously a tendentious translation. I'm asking for trouble by translating it as blue-eyed. The more conventional translation is grey-eyed, but there are other possible interpretations. It could even be owl-eyed, if you base it on the word for glauks, because remember, the owl is the animal sacred to Athena. It has been suggested that this epithet, γλαυκώπιν Athenain, is a sign of theriomorphic religion in early Greece. You know how Egyptian gods have animal heads? Well, there's a theory that maybe Greek gods once did as well, and that Athena's head was that of an owl. I don't think that's very likely, but it's a nice theory. I like it. it probably is a colour term. But the word γλαυκός, that is the colour term used here, doesn't have a tidy one-to-one correspondence with English colour terms. If you look at a good dictionary, if you look at the Liddell and Scott dictionary, you'll see it gives a range of different definitions, a range of different translations. The big problem with colours is that in the 19th century, English scholars, particularly William Gladstone, assumed that there's something objective about colour categories. He knew that there was this canon of 7 main colours, Roy G. Biv, red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, violet, and he regarded that as a canon of 7 objective, real colours. I mean, of course, they are real colours. The problem is where you draw the dividing lines between them. And different languages draw different dividing lines. People like Gladstone assumed that those dividing lines are objective. They're not, of course. And if you know, there are many modern languages that have different dividing lines as well. If you, for example, know any Russian, you'll know that the word blue has to be translated different ways into Russian depending on what kind of blue it is. And even in much more proximate languages to English, the English word purple doesn't have a tidy translation into German, for example. There's lila, but lila is more lilac, or it's a violet. You've also got a word purpur, which can also be translated into English as purple, but purpur also includes things like certain shades of red. Colour terms are not one-to-one in different languages, and it's silly to pretend that they are. As a result, Gladstone thought there was no word for blue in Homer. And that's flat out false. And this is the word for blue, γλαυκός. The catch is that it doesn't have an exact one-to-one correspondence with the English word blue. The Greek colour terms divide the blue area of the colour palette into a range of different terms. Γλαυκός covers relatively low saturation shades, but it also includes low saturation shades of green. And it can also be used for more greyish shades of those two colours as well. And for darker shades of blue, there's kyanios. So there is, you've got multiple terms where English has just one term. But if you actually go and look at a colour palette, you'll see that blue covers an absurdly large area of the colour palette. It actually does make more sense to divide it up into smaller regions, and that's what Greek does. As with translating colour terms between modern languages, if you're translating from, say, English to Homeric Greek, you need to know what shade of blue you're talking about before you know whether to translate it as γλαυκός or kyanios. And similarly, if you've got γλαυκός in Homer, you need to know what it's referring to before you can translate it into English. Γλαυκός can refer to the colour of eyes, as here. It can refer to the sky. It can refer to the colour of, that is a clear sky on a sunny day. It can refer to also things that we would call green in English, like the colour of certain leaves, and to the sea. So, colour terms are a trap, and the myth that there's no ancient Greek word for blue is just that. It's a myth. What the real problem is that people don't appreciate that different languages divide up the colour palette in totally different ways. Let's move on to the actual speech. Telemachos addresses Athena. Dear guest, maybe you'd be indignant at what I say. This is what these people care about: music and song. Easy when it's someone else's livelihood they're eating. A man. Well, somewhere his white bones are rotting in the rain, lying on a beach, or in the sea rolling in the waves. Now, this is obviously a very moving picture. It's a very immediate and striking picture. The idea of these bones rotting on a beach. But do notice that, first, we're talking about Odysseus, and second, remember what we saw in episode 1, in the proem of the Odyssey. The use or avoidance of Odysseus's name is thematically important in the Odyssey, and that's what we see here. Telemachus actively avoids using the name Odysseus. He calls him aneros. Line 161, aneros. It's the same word that started off the Odyssey, andra, this time in the genitive case. He doesn't introduce him he doesn't actually make it clear at all that he's talking about his father. That's implicit. You have to understand that. He just calls him aneros, a man. Just like line 1 of the Odyssey, tell me news of a man. A man, well, somewhere his white bones are rotting in the rain. And the rest of the speech continues in the same vein. Line 166, homen, he's died a bad death. Line 177, kainos, he was big on socializing with people. There are repeated references to Odysseus, but no mention of his name. And as I've said in episode 1, this is thematically important. Trying to pin down an exact meaning for the implications, the intent is always hazardous. You can never tell what a poet is thinking, or what a storyteller is thinking. What we can talk about is the effect. And in this case, I guess the effect is that the avoidance of Odysseus's name conveys a sense that he is a sense of his distance, of his absence. It's once he returns that the avoidance or use of his name becomes much more in your face. In the second half of the Odyssey, when Odysseus actually gets to Ithaca, it's really, really in your face when he avoids using his name. Here it's a bit more subtle, but it's still really striking. He's talking to someone he doesn't know. He doesn't know who the person he's talking to yet, but he just starts off talking about his father by referring to him as aneros, a man. And that's all we get. So it's a rather striking way of doing it. A little bit subtle. It's easy to miss in translation, I think. It's easy to miss in Greek too, but if you think about what's actually going on in terms of storytelling, it's pretty obvious here as well. He's died a bad death. Telemachus is convinced that Odysseus is dead, but then he goes on to ask questions of his guest. Who are you among men? Where is your city, your parents? Where are you from? What kind of ship did you arrive on? That kind of thing. These lines are bracketed in West's edition because they are reportedly missing in some ancient copies. We don't actually have copies where they're missing, but some ancient commentaries say that they are missing. And West is very free about choosing which manuscript evidence to select as his preferred readings. This is another case where he ignores all of the manuscript evidence in favour of some indirect reports. Later on, in lines 185 to 186, we actually do get 2 lines there. This is the lines, at my ship, she stands in the country near the city, at the harbour Reitron, below wooded Neion. Those lines do not get bracketed in West's edition, even though we actually do have copies, ancient copies. I'd say that the evidence for omitting them is actually stronger than in the case of lines 171 to 173. But West doesn't bracket those ones. He picks and chooses. It's not evidence-based, it's based on preference. Okay, let's move on to Athena's reply. She addressed him, the goddess blue-eyed Athena, γλαυκώπις Athene, line 178. And she puts on an act. She is playing the part of Mentes, son of Anchialos, the warlike. Line 180. Mentes Anchialoio daiphronos euchomai enai. Aquios. Mentes is a name that does pop up in some later tradition. Oh, yeah, he actually does pop up in the pseudo-Herodotean life of Homer as a figure in Homer's fictional biography. Oh, so does Phemios, actually. Phemios, according to that life, is supposedly Homer's teacher. But Mentes pops up as well. I don't know that we have any particular significance for the name Mentes. The name Anchialos, though, is pretty... it's a pretty obviously made-up name. It's a nonce name made up on the spot. Because it means by the sea, next to the sea, near the sea. So it's intended to evoke sea travel. And that's what we get in the subsequent lines as well. Mentes rules over the oar-loving Taphians. They love their boats. Taphioisi fileret moisin anasso. I rule over the Taphians, who love oars. Now, with my ship, I have come here, and my companions sailing on the wine-looking sea to foreign people, to Temese for bronze, and my freight is bright-coloured iron. Okay, there are several things to pick up on here. Let's start with the easy one. I've translated with my ship to reflect that the word xun here is not standard. It is an Attic form, and it is not alone in this passage. Reitroi below in line 186, the harbour. Reitron. You'll see it in translations as Reithron. In Ionic, it would be Reethron. And Xun, back in 9182, would be Sun. This is... and actually, in the case of Xun, it's the Atticism is there for metrical reasons. It wouldn't scan. The line wouldn't have the correct rhythm if Sun were used. But with Xun, the meter works out fine. There are not many Atticisms in Homer, so it's kind of striking to have a couple of them in fairly quick succession like this. That's the easy one. Second, wine-looking sea. Oinopa ponton. This is the phrase most traditionally translated as wine-dark sea. And that is the kind of implication you get from reading ancient etymologiae, dictionaries, glosses. If you look at Hezekias, for example, he translates oinops as dark, black even. But it's flat out not what the roots of the word mean. Oino, the oino bit means wine, and the opa bit means looking. It's wine-looking sea. That's the literal meaning. That doesn't actually clear up what it means. That's the big mystery, isn't it? Why does Homer call the sea wine-looking or wine-dark, if you really must? And the answer to that is we don't know. There are a few candidate explanations out there. At certain times of day, that's the colour that the Aegean Sea appears to take on. It's a poetic formula inherited from Near Eastern traditions. There are other explanations out there. None of them stand out as a clear winner. So really the answer is we simply don't know. Colour terms, and this is presumably intended to evoke colour in some fashion, colour terms are often metaphorical. I mean, there's one Attic tragedy from the 5th century that refers to green blood. Not because blood is green, but because it's freshly spilled. Metaphor is always a challenging thing to interpret when you see it used in colour terms. And this is probably metaphorical in some sense, but we don't know what the metaphorical flavour is. We don't know what the flavour of the metaphor is. And that's as much as we know. You can speculate all you like, but feel free to speculate on what the shade of metaphor is. Go ahead. Knock yourself out. the point is, there are no clear winners. We're not going to have a definite answer until someone comes up with some new piece of evidence. Until that happens, it's all just speculation. There is another colour term, a related colour term, aithos, which I suspect is related. Oinops means wine-looking, aithos means shiny-looking. And wine is often described as ἀείδων or aithos. So I suspect there is a link between oinops and aithos, but what exactly the nature of that link is a bit unclear. You could regard them as metrical equivalents, but most of the time when this formula appears, epi oinopa ponton, it appears in a context where you couldn't. I mean, there's no way, you cannot substitute aithopa and oinopa in different metrical contexts. There are technical reasons why that doesn't work. So the long and short of it is, we don't know. We don't know what the flavour of that metaphor is, but it's a really lovely metaphor, and everyone loves it. Third thing to comment on here, and we'd better finish with this, is the purpose of Menteis's journey. She, or he, or let's say they, are travelling to Temese for bronze, and my freight is bright-coloured iron. I've translated ἀείδων as bright-coloured, by the way, to emphasise that this is a colour term, no matter what Gladstone says. But the bronze and iron are the interesting thing here. If you read something like Eric Klein's very short introduction to the Trojan War, you'll see he goes on about how bronze, the use of bronze in Homer, shows that the Iliad is really a depiction of actual Bronze Age people doing Bronze Age things. Homer is perfectly well aware of the existence of iron and of the fact that iron is the most standard material to use for durable tools. Weapons tend to be bronze in Homer because bronze is glamorous. Bronze is the material you'll find used in dedicatory offerings in the Archaic period. But the material people actually use, that is to say for things like farming tools, and here for trade, that's iron. So it's a line like this makes it clear that the emphasis on bronze is a false archaism. Homer knows all about iron, and iron is not a prestige object in any sense. It's not super valuable. It is the standard material used for tools, and for most things other than glamorous things like weapons. So we are firmly embedded in the Archaic period here. This is obviously not a depiction of anything Bronze Age. The whole idea of trading bronze and iron is something embedded in the period of Greek colonization. We are firmly looking at a scene set in the 8th or 7th, or even around the 8th or 7th century. We'll have to stop here because we're a little short of time, but just a quick note, the rest of her reply does draw attention to Odysseus' father, Laertes. This is a bit of foreshadowing because we need to be told that Laertes is alive, otherwise we might assume he's dead. He doesn't appear in the narrative until book 24, so we need a bit of warning up front that he is actually around. And in line 197, we actually get the use of Odysseus' name, and it's in Athena's mouth, not Telemachos's. It's as though, as a goddess, she has access to divine knowledge of his identity. She knows all about him. It's Telemachos that he's distant from. So in Telemachos' speech, that sense of distance means that he goes unnamed. For Athena, there's no real distance because of her divine knowledge, and so the use of his name makes complete sense here. And she insists that Odysseus is still alive. Before we finish, I will point out that underneath the video I am putting some bibliography on musical performance. the kinds of musical instruments that we have evidence of in early Greece, and not so early, and also one book on the culture of singing poetry to the accompaniment of the kithara. That's Timothy Power's book, The Culture of Kitharoidia, and he doesn't devote a huge amount of time to Phemios, but he does spend some time on him, and he discusses the musical introduction, the instrumental introduction, the anabolē, at pages 185 to 187. So, we'll finish there. Next time we're going to carry on with the conversation, and we'll get some interesting business with pronouns, if I recall the text correctly. But for now, I will say goodbye and happy reading. I will just mention, I apologize that there has been a gap between the previous episode and this episode. That's because of health problems I've been having this winter. But I hope wherever you are staying well. Happy Homerizing.